Inside HMP Birmingham, when a prison loses control. December 16, 2016. Her Majesty's Prison Birmingham. 1:47 p.m. What you're about to hear is not a Hollywood script. This is the true story of the day one of Britain's most notorious prisons descended into complete anarchy. For 12 hours, inmates seized control of 4 entire wings. They set fires that raged through cell blocks. They destroyed everything in their path. Prison officers barricaded themselves in offices, desperately calling for help while chaos erupted around them. The sounds of breaking glass, screaming, and destruction echoed through corridors that had stood for over a century. This is the story of HMP Birmingham, a prison with a dark history pushed to its breaking point. A story of a system that failed, of men pushed too far, of violence, rebellion, and the thin line between order and absolute chaos. By the time the smoke cleared and the riot squads regained control, the damage was catastrophic. But the real question isn't what happened that day. It is how Britain allowed one of its prisons to fall so far that inmates felt they had nothing left to lose. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're re-watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The prison's dark legacy. HMP Birmingham wasn't always called Birmingham. For most of its existence, it was known by another name, Winson Green Prison, a name that struck fear into the hearts of criminals across Britain for over 170 years. Built in 1849, during the reign of Queen Victoria, this Victorian fortress was designed to break men. Its thick stone walls, imposing towers, and labyrinth of cell blocks were engineered for one purpose: punishment. This wasn't a place of rehabilitation. This was a place where society sent those it wanted to forget. The architecture itself was a weapon. Long, narrow wings radiated from a central hub like spokes on a wheel, a design called the radial plan that allowed guards to monitor hundreds of inmates from a single vantage point. The cells were small, cold, and deliberately uncomfortable. In the early days, prisoners were subjected to hard labor, solitary confinement, and brutal discipline. But Winson Green wasn't just any prison. It had a darker distinction. Between 1900 and 1963, 29 men walked through the doors of Winson Green knowing they would never leave alive. They were led down a corridor that became known as the Condemned Suite, a section of the prison reserved for those awaiting execution. The gallows were located in a small room, clinical and efficient. Drop, snap, death. Justice, they called it. Among those executed here were some of Britain's most infamous criminals. In 1910, Frederick Seddon was hanged for poisoning his lodger to steal her money. In 1925, Ernest Walker, known as the warehouse murderer, met his end here after beating a man to death during a robbery. The executions continued through 2 world wars, through the rise and fall of empires, until 1962 when James Smith became the last man to hang at Winson Green, convicted of murdering a woman in a frenzied attack. 1 year later, in 1963, Britain suspended capital punishment. The gallows fell silent. But the darkness that had soaked into those walls didn't disappear. It lingered. The transformation, Winson Green to HMP Birmingham. For decades after the execution stopped, Winson Green continued operating as a traditional Victorian prison. Overcrowded, outdated, but functional. It housed everyone from petty thieves to dangerous criminals, gang members from Birmingham's notorious streets, drug dealers, violent offenders, murderers serving life sentences. By the 1990s and 2000s, the prison was bursting at the seams. Britain's prison population was exploding, driven by tougher sentencing laws and the war on drugs. Winson Green, designed to hold around 600 inmates in the Victorian era, was now crammed with over 1,400 men. 2 inmates in cells built for 1. Tensions rising. Violence increasing. The government faced a crisis. Prisons across the country were overcrowded, understaffed, and desperately underfunded. The system was breaking down. Something had to change. In 2011, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government made a controversial decision. They would privatize several prisons, handing them over to private companies to manage. The logic was simple. Private companies could run prisons more efficiently, save taxpayers' money, and improve conditions. At least, that's what they promised. Winson Green was one of the prisons selected for privatization. In October 2011, a company called G4S, one of the world's largest security firms, took over management. The prison's name was officially changed from Winson Green to HMP Birmingham, though locals still called it by its old name. G4S promised reform. They promised better rehabilitation programs, improved safety, and a more humane approach to incarceration. They promised to transform this aging Victorian fortress into a modern, effective prison. But promises are cheap. Reality is expensive. The decline begins 2011 to 2014. The problems started almost immediately. G4S took over HMP Birmingham with ambitious plans, but from day one, they were cutting corners. The first thing they did was reduce staff. In the government-run era, the prison had maintained a certain ratio of officers to inmates, not perfect, but functional. G4S looked at those numbers and saw waste. They saw salaries that could be trimmed, pensions that didn't need to be paid. Experienced prison officers, some who had worked at Winson Green for decades, were offered redundancy packages. Many took them, unwilling to work under the new private regime. Others were let go. G4S replaced them with new recruits, younger, cheaper, and critically, far less experienced. Training a prison officer properly takes time. You need to understand inmate psychology, de-escalation techniques, security protocols, and how to read the subtle signs that violence is brewing. The veteran officers knew the inmates, knew the rhythms of the prison, knew when something was off. The new officers had none of this knowledge. Many were fresh out of brief training courses, thrown into one of Britain's toughest prisons with minimal preparation. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and often terrified. The inmates noticed immediately. In prison, respect isn't given, it's earned. And these new officers hadn't earned anything. The inmates tested them. Small things at first. Refusing orders. Talking back. Seeing how far they could push before facing consequences. When consequences didn't come, or came inconsistently, the inmates pushed further. By 2012, violence inside HMP Birmingham was increasing. Assaults on staff rose by 30% in the first year under G4S management. Inmate-on-inmate violence spiked even higher. The prison was becoming more dangerous, not safer. But violence wasn't the only problem. Drugs were flooding in. The drug epidemic, 2013 to 2015. Prisons have always struggled with contraband, but what happened at HMP Birmingham between 2013 and 2016 was unprecedented. The drug trade inside the prison exploded into a full-scale epidemic. The most devastating substance wasn't heroin or cocaine. It was something newer, cheaper, and far more dangerous: synthetic cannabinoids, known on the streets as spice or black mamba. Spice was designed to mimic the effects of cannabis, but it was far more potent and unpredictable. A single dose could leave someone catatonic, violent, or suffering seizures. In the confined environment of a prison, where stress and boredom were constant companions, spice became the escape of choice. And it was everywhere. How did it get in? The methods were creative and constantly evolving. Some were smuggled in by visitors, small packages concealed in body cavities or passed during embraces. Some was thrown over the prison walls in tennis balls or packages attached to drones. Some was even sprayed onto legal papers or greeting cards in liquid form, then dried and sent through the mail. Once inside, the paper would be torn up and smoked. But the most disturbing method involved corruption. Several investigations later revealed that some prison staff were being paid to smuggle drugs inside. The impact of the spice epidemic was catastrophic. Inmates became zombies, wandering the wings in drug-induced stupors. Medical emergencies skyrocketed. Fights broke out over drug debts. The few remaining experienced officers watched in horror as the prison they once knew descended into chaos. And G4S? Their response was inadequate at best, negligent at worst. Random drug tests were inconsistent. Searches were often cursory. The measures needed to stop the flood of drugs, more officers, better training, improved security technology, cost money. Money that G4S wasn't willing to spend because it would cut into their profits. By 2015, HMP Birmingham had one of the highest rates of drug use in the entire British prison system. Former inmates later describe it as easier to get drugs inside than on the streets of Birmingham. The breaking point, warnings ignored, 2015 to 2016. Throughout 2015 and early 2016, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Unless, of course, you were profiting from ignoring them. In March 2015, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons conducted a surprise inspection of HMP Birmingham. What they found shocked even the most seasoned inspectors. The report, published 2 months later, was damning. They found inmates locked in cells for up to 23 hours a day due to staff shortages. They found broken windows that hadn't been repaired for months. They found inadequate healthcare, with prisoners waiting weeks to see doctors or dentists. They found a culture of fear among both staff and inmates. Most concerning, they found evidence that the prison was becoming increasingly unstable. Gang activity was rampant. Violent incidents were being underreported to make statistics look better. Officers admitted they felt unable to control the wings, especially during evenings and weekends when staffing levels dropped to dangerously low numbers. The Chief Inspector of Prisons wrote in the report, "Birmingham is a prison in crisis. Without urgent intervention, we fear a serious incident is inevitable." The report made headlines for a day, then disappeared from public consciousness. G4S issued a statement promising improvements. The Ministry of Justice expressed concern and promised to monitor the situation closely. Nothing meaningful changed. By autumn 2016, the situation had deteriorated further. Officers were calling in sick at record rates, unwilling or unable to face another shift in such dangerous conditions. This created a vicious cycle. Fewer officers meant more stress on those who did show up, which led to more sick calls, which led to even fewer officers. The prison was operating with sometimes half the officers it needed. Wings that should have had 6 officers were running with 3 or even 2. During night shifts, entire sections of the prison might have just 1 officer responsible for hundreds of inmates. The inmates knew it. They could feel the institution crumbling around them. The unwritten rules that kept prison society functioning, the balance between control and tolerance, were breaking down. And then came December 2016. The spark, December 16th, 2016, morning. Friday, December 16th, 2016. The last Friday before Christmas. Inside HMP Birmingham, the morning started like any other. Breakfast was served. Inmates were unlocked for their daily routines. Some went to work in the prison workshops. Others attended education classes or gym sessions. Most just tried to get through another day. But tensions were high. They had been for months. Just days earlier, there had been a violent incident on N Wing, one of the prison's most volatile sections. An inmate had been seriously assaulted by a rival gang member. The attack happened in broad daylight, in a communal area, with officers present. But there were only 2 officers on duty for over 200 inmates. They couldn't stop it. They could barely respond. The victim was hospitalized. The attacker was placed in segregation, but everyone knew he'd be back on the wings eventually. This was how it worked now. Violence, minimal consequences, more violence. The inmates were angry, not just about that specific incident, but about everything. The overcrowding, the drugs, the lack of programs and purposeful activity, the feeling of being warehoused and forgotten. Many had been waiting months for court dates or parole hearings that kept being postponed. Time was standing still, and desperation was growing. The officers were angry too. They were exhausted, afraid, and feeling abandoned by G4S management. Many felt the company cared more about profits than safety. They'd raised concerns repeatedly about staffing levels, about the drug problem, about the deteriorating conditions. They'd been told to do more with less, to work smarter not harder, to implement new initiatives without any additional resources. It was a pressure cooker, and the heat was rising. At approximately 1:30 p.m. on December 16, 2016, a routine situation spiraled out of control. On N Wing, an officer was conducting a cell search. This was standard procedure, random searches to look for contraband, weapons, or anything prohibited. The officer entered a cell on the 3rd floor landing while the inmate waited outside. What exactly happened next would later be disputed, but the result was undeniable. The search uncovered a mobile phone, a serious violation of prison rules. Mobile phones were gold in prison. They meant contact with the outside world, the ability to run criminal enterprises, to intimidate witnesses, to maintain gang connections. The officer confiscated the phone. The inmate protested, claimed it wasn't his, said it must have been planted. The argument escalated. Voices were raised. Other inmates on the landing started paying attention. And then someone made a decision that changed everything. Another inmate, watching the confrontation, shouted, "They're always taking our stuff. We don't have to put up with this anymore." It was a match to gasoline. Within seconds, other inmates started shouting. Then they started moving, surrounding the officer. Not threatening violence yet, but clearly intimidating. The officer radioed for backup, trying to maintain composure, but you could hear the tension in his voice. 3 more officers responded, rushing to N wing. But 3 more officers weren't enough. There were over 200 inmates on that wing, and the mood was shifting by the second. One inmate grabbed a snooker cue from the recreation room and smashed it against a wall, creating a weapon. Another picked up a chair. The officers began backing toward the wing office, a secure room where they could lock themselves in if necessary. And then someone threw the first punch. The assault on the officer was swift and brutal. He went down hard, other officers trying to pull him away as inmates surged forward. The prison alarm began wailing, a sound that would continue for the next 12 hours. The officers made it to the wing office and slammed the door, locking themselves inside. Through the reinforced glass, they watched as N wing exploded into chaos. Inmates were running wild, shouting, celebrating their newfound power. Some started smashing cell windows with whatever they could find. Others broke into the storage areas, looking for anything useful. The more organized inmates headed straight for the offices, knowing that's where keys, radios, and other valuable items were kept. But the riot didn't stay contained to N wing. Prison communication networks, both official and unofficial, spread the word instantly. Officers on other wings radioed desperately for help. Inmates on other wings heard the alarm and saw staff suddenly trying to lock everyone down. But they couldn't lock down fast enough. On M wing, directly adjacent to N wing, inmates refused to return to their cells. When officers tried to force compliance, they met resistance. More violence erupted. More officers retreated to secure areas. On P wing and Q wing, similar scenes played out. It was as if a dam had burst. Years of tension, frustration, and anger were flooding out all at once. By 2:15 p.m., just 45 minutes after the initial confrontation, inmates had effective control of 4 entire wings of HMP Birmingham. Hundreds of prisoners, no longer confined, no longer controlled. And the real destruction was just beginning. What happened over the next several hours wasn't random violence. It was systematic destruction, driven by rage and purpose. The inmates knew exactly what they were doing. Many had been incarcerated for years, some in multiple prisons. They understood how the system worked, and they knew how to hurt it. First, they destroyed the CCTV cameras. Inmates climbed on top of cells and smashed every camera they could reach, eliminating the prison's electronic eyes. Without cameras, authorities outside couldn't see what was happening inside. The riot was becoming a black box. Next, they targeted the communication systems. They found radios left behind by retreating officers and destroyed them. They ripped phone lines from walls. They wanted to isolate the prison, to make rescue difficult. Then came the fires. Someone on N wing started burning mattresses. The thick, toxic smoke filled the wing within minutes. The old Victorian ventilation system, never designed for modern materials, spread the smoke throughout the prison. Inmates on other wings, seeing the smoke, started their own fires. Soon, 4 separate blazes were burning across the facility. But they didn't burn everything. They were selective. Education rooms? Burned. Chapel? Burned. Workshop areas? Destroyed. These were the places where the prison pretended to rehabilitate them, and the inmates wanted them gone. But the cells? Mostly untouched. The inmates knew they'd eventually have to sleep somewhere. They broke into storage areas and stole food, drinks, and supplies. They raided the medical area looking for prescription medications, some for personal use, others to sell when order was restored. They found the prison's stockpile of recreation equipment and entertainment systems. Tables, chairs, and other furniture were used as battering rams to break through locked doors. The violence was mostly directed at property, not people. But there were exceptions. Certain inmates became targets. Prison informants, grassers in prison slang, who had cooperated with authorities were hunted. Some locked themselves in cells and barricaded the doors. Others weren't so lucky. Several were beaten severely, though remarkably, no one was killed. Sex offenders faced particular danger. British prisons segregate sex offenders for their own protection, but during the chaos, some protective measures broke down. Inmates broke into segregated areas looking for those they considered the lowest of the low. Some sex offenders were dragged out and assaulted. Prison has its own brutal hierarchy, and without officers to maintain order, that hierarchy was enforced with fists and improvised weapons. Meanwhile, officers trapped in wing offices were making desperate calls. Some phoned their families, unsure if they'd make it home. Others coordinated with the central control room, trying to provide information about what was happening. The central control room, located in the secure administrative section, became the command center. Senior managers huddled around monitors showing static from destroyed cameras, listening to panic radio calls, trying to formulate a response. But G4S was overwhelmed. This wasn't a disturbance they could handle with their own resources. They needed help. Serious help. At 3:17 p.m., G4S officially requested emergency assistance from the National Offender Management Service, the government agency overseeing all prisons. The request was simple but terrifying. We've lost control. We need immediate intervention. The government's tornado teams were activated. Tornado teams are the British prison system's elite tactical units. Think SWAT teams, but specialized for prison riots. Every officer on a tornado team is extensively trained in riot control, close quarters combat, negotiation, and the use of force in confined spaces. They're equipped with full-body armor, helmets with face shields, batons, and sometimes chemical agents like CS spray. Their primary mission is simple: restore order by any means necessary, minimize casualties on both sides, and regain control of the facility. But deploying tornado teams isn't instantaneous. They have to be mobilized from prisons across the region, briefed on the situation, equipped, and transported. It takes time. Time the inmates were using to their advantage. While tornado teams prepared, the riot continued to evolve. By 4 p.m., a strange sort of organization had emerged within the chaos. Natural leaders among the inmates stepped forward. Some were gang leaders. Others were inmates with long sentences who had nothing to lose. A few were actually trying to prevent the situation from getting worse. On N Wing, which had started the whole situation, a group of inmates had taken over the central area. They'd created a kind of command post, stockpiling supplies and trying to coordinate with inmates on other wings through shouted messages and hand signals through windows. Their demands started to emerge, shouted to officers in the central control room through intact intercoms. We want the media here. We want people to know how we are being treated. We want G4S out. We want government control back. We want an end to the spice epidemic. You've let this place become a drug den. We want proper staffing levels. We want safety. We want to be treated like human beings, not animals. Some demands were reasonable. Others were unrealistic. But they all spoke to the same core issue. The inmates felt abandoned, dehumanized, and desperate. As evening approached, a weird calm settled over parts of the prison. The initial fury had burned itself out somewhat. Inmates were exhausted. Some were coming down from adrenaline highs. Others were getting hungry despite the food they'd stolen. On M Wing, a group of inmates actually tried to negotiate. They sent a message through an officer's radio they'd captured, asking to speak with senior management. They said they'd hand over control peacefully if certain guarantees were made about improving conditions. But G4S and the government had already made their decision. There would be no negotiation. Not while the prison was still in inmate hands. The official position was clear: restore order first, address grievances later. At 5:47 p.m., as darkness fell over Birmingham, the first tornado teams arrived at the prison gates. Over 100 specialist riot officers from prisons across the Midlands, London, and the South East. They set up a staging area in the prison's secure administrative wing, away from the rioting areas. The plan was being finalized. They would go in at dawn. But they couldn't just charge in blindly. The prison was a maze of Victorian corridors, multiple floors, hundreds of cells. The inmates had barricaded doors and had height advantages from the upper landings. A poorly executed assault could result in serious injuries or deaths, officer and inmate alike. So they waited, gathered intelligence, planned their approach. And inside the rioting wings, the inmates waited too. Some slept, exhausted from hours of destruction. Others stood watch, knowing the counterattack was coming. A few started to regret their involvement, realizing the consequences they'd face. The long night had begun. The night, darkness and uncertainty, 6 p.m. midnight, nightfall brought a different atmosphere to HMP Birmingham. The fires had mostly burned out, leaving behind acrid smoke and the smell of destruction. Emergency lighting created eerie shadows through the wings. The temperature was dropping, December in England, and with broken windows throughout the facility, the cold was creeping in. The inmates had won a battle, but they were beginning to realize they couldn't win the war. This wasn't a prison break. There was nowhere to go. The walls still stood. Armed police had surrounded the facility's perimeter. Helicopters circled overhead, thermal cameras scanning for any escape attempts. This was a temporary kingdom built on anger, and everyone knew it would fall. The only questions were when and how violently. On N Wing, the leaders were arguing. Some wanted to surrender peacefully before the tornado teams came in. They'd made their point, shown the world that HMP Birmingham was broken. Going further would only result in longer sentences and harsher treatment. Others disagreed. They wanted to hold out, to force real negotiations, to extract promises of reform before giving up their leverage. They pointed to previous prison riots in British history where inmate demands had been partially met in exchange for peaceful surrender. But there was a third group, the ones who didn't care about demands or negotiations. They just wanted to break things, to feel powerful for once, to hurt the system that had hurt them. These were the dangerous ones, the unpredictable element that made the situation so volatile. Meanwhile, the trapped officers were experiencing their own nightmare. Some had been locked in wing offices for over 8 hours now. They had limited food and water. They could hear the destruction around them but couldn't see much. Every loud noise made them jump. They didn't know if the inmates would eventually turn on them. One officer later described the experience in an interview. "We could hear them outside, smashing things, shouting. We didn't know if they'd try to force their way in. We had no weapons, no real way to defend ourselves. We just had to wait and hope." At 8:23 p.m., something unexpected happened. An inmate on P Wing started having a medical emergency. He consumed a large quantity of spice earlier in the riot and was now experiencing severe side effects: convulsions, difficulty breathing, incoherent speech. Other inmates, despite the chaos, called for help. They banged on pipes and shouted until they got the attention of officers in a nearby secure area. A difficult decision had to be made: send medical staff into an active riot zone to help an inmate. After tense negotiations through intercoms, a deal was struck. The inmates on P Wing would allow a medical team to enter, treat the sick inmate, and leave without interference. In exchange, the medical team would bring additional food and water. It was a surreal moment of cooperation amid the chaos. The medical team, 2 nurses and a doctor, escorted by 2 officers in riot gear, entered P Wing. The inmates kept their word. They stood back, allowed treatment, and actually helped carry the sick inmate to the wing entrance where he could be evacuated. This small moment of humanity was a glimmer of hope that perhaps the situation could be resolved without major violence. But it was just a glimmer. On N Wing, the most volatile section, tensions were rising again. A fight broke out between 2 inmate factions, one that wanted to surrender, another that wanted to keep fighting. The disagreement turned physical. Other inmates had to break it up. The prison was fracturing along multiple lines: inmates versus staff, inmates versus inmates, reasonable voices versus extremists. And through it all, the tornado teams waited, watching, planning, preparing for the moment they'd be unleashed. Midnight to dawn, the darkest hours, 12 a.m. to 5 a.m. The hours between midnight and dawn are the loneliest, the coldest, the most psychologically draining. Time seems to slow down. Exhaustion sets in. Reality becomes surreal. Inside the rioting wings of HMP Birmingham, many inmates tried to sleep. They'd barricaded themselves in cells, sometimes in groups for safety. The adrenaline had worn off. The cold was biting. The reality of what they'd done was sinking in. They knew they'd face consequences. Extra years on their sentences. Loss of privileges. Transfer to higher security facilities. Potential assault charges for those who'd attacked staff or other inmates. Some wrote letters to family members, not knowing if they'd ever get mailed. Others just stared at the ceiling, replaying the day's events in their minds. A few prayed, despite rarely doing so before. On M Wing, an older inmate named Marcus Williams, serving 15 years for armed robbery, later described that night in a letter that was eventually leaked to the press. "I'd been in prison for 8 years by that point. I'd seen violence, I'd seen protests, but I'd never seen anything like this. When the riot started, I got caught up in it. The anger just took over. We were tired of being treated like we didn't matter. But that night, sitting in a freezing cold cell with smoke still in the air, I started thinking about my daughter. She was 12. What would she think of me now? I'd already let her down by ending up in prison. Now I was part of a riot. I made a decision that night. When they came to retake the prison, I wouldn't resist. I'd had my moment of rage. It was time to face the consequences. Not everyone felt that remorse. On N Wing, the hardcore group was planning resistance. They'd identified choke points where they could slow down the tornado teams. They'd gathered improvised weapons, chair legs, broken glass, anything that could cause harm. They knew they couldn't win, but they could make the retaking costly. At 2:37 a.m., there was another medical emergency. An inmate on Q Wing had attempted suicide. The discovery sent shockwaves through that section. The inmate had been depressed for months, facing a life sentence with no hope of parole. The riot had pushed him over the edge. This time, the rescue was more complicated. The inmate was in a critical condition and needed immediate hospitalization. But Q Wing was still hostile territory. The tornado teams had to make a limited incursion just to extract one person. It was a preview of what was coming. As dawn approached, the cold December morning brought a heavy mist over Birmingham. Inside the prison, you could see your breath. The heating system had been damaged in the riot, and with so many broken windows, the temperature inside was barely above freezing. At 5 a.m., the command decision was made. The tornado teams would begin their assault at 6 a.m. as the sun rose. They'd start with M Wing, which intelligence suggested had the least organized resistance. Once M Wing was secured, they'd move to P Wing, then Q Wing. N Wing, the epicenter of the riot, would be last. The officers were woken, briefed, and equipped. Over 100 men and women, dressed in full riot gear, mentally preparing for what they'd face. Some had been through prison riots before. Others hadn't. All knew it would be dangerous, unpredictable, and potentially traumatic. The plan was methodical. Advance in formation, shields interlocked, batons ready. Use verbal commands first, force only when necessary. Separate compliant inmates from resistors immediately. Secure each section before moving to the next. Medical teams would follow close behind to treat injuries. Chemical agents would be used if needed, but sparingly. Tear gas in enclosed prison wings could cause serious harm, and there were concerns about inmates with respiratory conditions. The goal was to end this with no deaths and minimal serious injuries. But everyone knew that once they breached those wings, anything could happen. At 5:47 a.m., the sky began to lighten. A cold, grey December dawn. At 5:55 a.m., the tornado teams moved into position. At 6 a.m., the assault began. The retaking begins, M Wing assault, 6 a.m. to 7:30 a.m., December 17th, 2016. 6 a.m. exactly. The heavy steel door to M Wing burst open with a deafening crash. The tornado teams flooded in, a wall of shields and helmets moving in perfect formation. Their boots thundered on the Victorian tile floors. Voices boomed through the wing, "Get down! Get on the ground now! Hands where we can see them!" The sound was overwhelming, deliberately so. It's a tactic called shock and awe. Flood the senses, create confusion, establish dominance immediately. The inmates who'd been sleeping jerked awake. Those who'd been waiting knew their time was up. On the ground floor of M Wing, most inmates complied immediately. They'd had all night to think about this moment. Fighting riot-trained officers in full gear was suicide. They dropped to their stomachs, hands behind their heads, as they'd been trained to do countless times before. The tornado teams moved with practiced precision. Some officers maintained the shield wall, protecting the others. Behind them, extraction teams moved quickly to each compliant inmate, securing their hands with plastic zip tie restraints, checking them for weapons, then moving them to a secured area. But compliance wasn't universal. On the second floor landing, a group of about 15 inmates had barricaded themselves behind overturned tables and smouldering debris from the previous day's fires. They weren't going quietly. "Stay back. We'll come down when we are ready," one shouted. The tornado team commander, a veteran officer named Derek Morrison with 20 years of experience, assessed the situation. He could order his teams to charge up the stairs, but the inmates had the high ground. They could drop heavy objects, throw things, create injuries. Morrison made a decision. He activated his megaphone. "You have 60 seconds to comply. Come down the stairs, hands visible, or we will use chemical agents. This is your only warning." 60 seconds of tense silence. The restrained inmates on the ground floor watched. The tornado teams waited, shields ready. Everyone held their breath. At 55 seconds, one inmate from the barricaded group stood up. "I'm done, man. I'm coming down." He walked slowly down the stairs, hands raised high. Then another. Then 3 more. But 10 inmates remained behind the barricade. Morrison gave a signal. 2 officers with chemical agent launchers stepped forward. There was a hollow pop as CS gas canisters were fired onto the second-floor landing. White smoke billowed immediately. Within seconds, the inmates behind the barricade were coughing, eyes streaming, unable to see. They stumbled down the stairs, choking and disoriented. Officers grabbed them, restrained them, moved them to the secured area. No punches thrown. No batons used. Just efficient, professional control. By 7:30 a.m., M Wing was fully secured. 187 inmates restrained and accounted for. No serious injuries on either side. A textbook operation. 1 wing down. 3 to go. The success on M Wing gave the Tornado team's confidence and momentum. Intelligence from officers who'd been trapped in Wing officers suggested P Wing would be similar to M Wing. Some resistance, but mostly inmates who were ready to surrender. They were right. P Wing fell even faster than M Wing. The inmates had heard the commotion from M Wing. They knew resistance was futile. When the Tornado teams breached P Wing at 7:52 a.m., over 80% of the inmates immediately complied. There was one tense moment when an inmate grabbed a makeshift weapon, a snooker cue with nails driven through one end, and advanced on the officers. "Don't be stupid, man. It's over," one of them shouted. The would-be attacker was restrained and removed. The inmates who'd stop him were noted in reports. By 8:47 a.m., P Wing was secured. 203 inmates restrained. The operation was going better than anyone had dared hope. Q Wing followed at 9:15 a.m. This wing had the smallest inmate population and had been one of the less destructive areas during the riot. The Tornado teams encountered virtually no resistance. Inmates lined up voluntarily, hands visible, ready to be processed. By 10 a.m., Q Wing was clear. 3 wings secured in 4 hours. Remarkably, there had been no serious violence during the retaking. No officers seriously hurt. But everyone knew N Wing would be different. N Wing. Where it all started. The epicenter of the riot. Through the morning, while the Tornado team secured the other wings, the inmates on N Wing had been preparing. And the hardcore group, about 40 inmates led by a 29-year-old gang member named Terrence T-Block Williams, had decided they would go down without a fight. T-Block was serving a 20-year sentence for drug trafficking and firearms offenses. He had nothing to lose. His gang controlled drug distribution on N Wing, and the riot had actually strengthened his position. He wasn't surrendering to anyone. The Tornado teams gathered outside N Wing at 10:15 a.m. This time, they brought additional resources. More officers. Medical teams standing by. Commander Morrison studied the wing through reinforced observation windows. The damage was extensive. Broken glass everywhere. Furniture smashed and piled as barricades. Smoke stains on walls and ceilings. Morrison tried negotiation first. He used the intercom system, his voice echoing through N Wing. "This is Commander Morrison of the National Tornado Team. The riot is over. Put down any weapons, come to the ground floor with your hands visible, and no one will be hurt. You have 10 minutes to comply." The response came quickly. "We want media here. We want guarantees from the government, not G4S. We want. There will be no negotiations while you hold this wing. Come down now and your cooperation will be noted. This is your last chance. Then come and get us." The inmate disappeared back into the shadows of the upper landing. At 10:27 a.m., the Tornado teams breached N Wing. The moment the doors opened, objects started raining down from above. The Tornado teams raised their shields, forming a protective shell as they advanced into the wing. Shields up. Maintain formation. Morrison commanded. They pushed forward, shields locked together, a moving wall of protection. The white smoke began filling the wing again, but this time the inmates were prepared. The first stairwell was barricaded with mattresses, tables, and debris. An officer's shield cracked as a small television set smashed into it. Progress was slow, methodical, dangerous. On the ground floor, about 30 inmates who wanted no part of the fight voluntarily surrendered. The Tornado teams reached the second floor at 11:03 a.m. They encountered another barricade, this one more sophisticated. Morrison made a decision. They'd use more gas, more shock tactics. The force of the water began breaking apart the makeshift fortification. As the barricade fell, the tornado team surged forward. Now they met direct resistance. Inmates swinging chair legs. The officers responded with controlled force. Batons were used, striking inmates' arms and legs, aiming to disable without causing serious injury. One inmate managed to grab an officer's baton and tried to use it against him. He fought hard, screaming obscenities, but was eventually restrained. He'd be charged with assaulting an officer later. By 11:45 a.m., the second and third floors were secured. About 40 inmates remained free, including T-Block and his core group. They'd made their last stand at the end of the fourth floor corridor, in an area near the showers. The fourth floor corridor of N Wing was narrow. Victorian prisons weren't designed with modern riot control in mind. It would have to be a smaller unit, advancing carefully into tight quarters where the inmates' desperation could be most dangerous. Commander Morrison called for a pause. He had megaphones brought up and positioned himself at the bottom of the fourth floor stairwell, protected by shields but visible. Terrence Williams. Morrison's voice boomed through the corridor. I know you're up there. I know you're leading this. You've made your point. Maybe attempted murder charges if any of my officers get seriously hurt. Is that what you want? Silence for a moment. Then T-Block appeared at the far end of the corridor, silhouetted in the dim emergency lighting. You think I care about more years? T-Block shouted back. I'm already doing 20. What's 25? My life is over anyway. At least today I'm somebody. At least today people know my name. Morrison kept his voice calm, professional. Your life isn't over, Terrence. You're 29 years old. Not if you hurt someone today. Good behavior. In this place? You know what they've turned this prison into? It's hell. It's worse than hell. Well, I'm not going to be forgotten. Behind him, Morrison could see the other inmates shifting nervously. Morrison sensed the weakness. Anyone who surrenders right now walks away with minimal additional consequences. You have my word. It worked. 5 inmates immediately broke from the group and walked toward the tornado teams, hands raised. Then 3 more. Then another 4. T-Block spun around, furious. One of the departing inmates stopped and looked back. Yeah, T. We are giving up. Because this is insane. By 12:15 p.m., only 12 inmates remained with T-Block. 12 against over 50 tornado officers. The math was brutal and obvious. Morrison gave the final warning. Last chance, Williams. Everyone else has surrendered. Are you really going to let them get hurt for your ego? Are you really going to make this worse? For a long moment, T-Block didn't respond. The desire to be somebody versus the reality of the situation. Then his shoulders sagged. The fight went out of him. All right, we are coming down. Just don't hurt anyone. No one will be hurt if you comply, Morrison promised. At 12:24 p.m., T-Block and his remaining followers walked slowly down the corridor, hands raised, weapons dropped. T-Block was placed in restraints. As he was led away, he looked at Morrison. You tell them. You tell the media. You tell the government. Morrison nodded. I'll put it in my report. At 12:30 p.m., exactly 12 hours after the riot began, HMP Birmingham was back under official control. The immediate aftermath, counting the cost, 12:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. The silence that fell over HMP Birmingham after the retaking was eerie. For 12 hours, the prison had echoed with shouts, crashes, alarms, and chaos. Now there was just the sound of boots on floors, radios crackling, and the occasional cough from inmates still feeling the effects of CS gas. The scale of the destruction became apparent as officers and investigators began to assess each wing. N Wing was devastated. Over 200 cells were damaged. Windows shattered. Furniture destroyed. Walls blackened by fire. The education center was a total loss, burned to the foundations. The chapel was heavily damaged. The medical wing had been ransacked. M, P, and Q wings had suffered less severe but still significant damage. Broken windows throughout. Destroyed CCTV systems. Smashed doors. Water damage from the fire suppression systems that had activated during the blazes. The initial cost estimate was staggering, over £6 million in damage. And that was just the physical infrastructure. The cost in other ways, trauma, legal proceedings, increased security, would be far higher. But remarkably, considering the violence and duration of the riot, casualties were relatively light. No deaths. No life-threatening injuries. Several officers had minor injuries, bruises, cuts, one broken finger. About 20 inmates had injuries ranging from cuts and bruises to more serious issues from gas exposure or fights with other inmates. The inmate who'd attempted suicide on Q Wing survived and was transferred to a secure hospital psychiatric unit. The inmate who'd had the spice-induced medical emergency was recovering in a regular hospital under guard. All 598 inmates who'd been in the rioting wings were now secured. They were separated into different categories: active participants in violence or destruction, 127 inmates; passive participants who didn't resist but didn't help stop it, 389 inmates; inmates who actively helped during the crisis, medical emergencies, preventing worse violence, 14 inmates; inmates who'd locked themselves in cells and avoided participation, 68 inmates. Each category would face different consequences. The processing began immediately. Each inmate was photographed, searched thoroughly, interviewed, and assessed for injuries or medical needs. This wasn't just about punishment. Investigators needed to understand what had happened, who had done what, and why. The prison's secure wings, which hadn't been affected by the riot, were repurposed to hold the inmates from the damaged areas. It was cramped, uncomfortable, but necessary. Some inmates were immediately transferred to other prisons, especially the identified ringleaders like T-Block who couldn't remain at Birmingham for security reasons. The officers who'd been trapped during the riot were finally free. Some broke down crying with relief. Others were numb, still processing what they'd experienced. All were sent home with instructions to seek counseling. Several would never return to prison work, traumatized by those 12 hours of helplessness. Because by now, the world knew. News of the riot had broken on social media first. Inmates had used smuggled phones to post updates, photos, and videos during the chaos. Some footage showed inmates celebrating their temporary freedom. Other clips showed fires burning and destruction being wrought. Mainstream media had picked up the story by evening on December 16th, but information had been limited while the riot was ongoing. Now, with it over, the media wanted answers. The reporters erupted with questions. How did you lose control of 4 wings? Is it true staff shortages caused this? What about the drug problem at Birmingham? Will you resign? Is G4S going to give up the contract? The investigation begins, searching for truth, December 17th to 31st, 2016. Within hours of the riot's end, multiple investigations were launched. The sheer scale of what had happened, a major British prison falling to inmate control for 12 hours, demanded answers. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons announced an emergency inspection. The same inspectors who'd warned in 2015 that Birmingham was a prison in crisis would return to see how bad things had truly become. The Ministry of Justice launched its own inquiry, headed by a senior civil servant with experience in prison management. Their mandate was simple: find out what went wrong and who was responsible. The local police opened criminal investigations into specific incidents during the riot: assaults on officers, destruction of property, drug possession. They'd be filing charges against dozens of inmates. And internally, G4S conducted its own investigation, though many questioned how objective a company could be when investigating its own failures. The evidence was overwhelming. Investigators had access to thousands of hours of footage from before the riot, when cameras still worked. They had testimony from hundreds of inmates and officers. They had physical evidence in the form of smuggled contraband, weapons, drugs, and phones found during the cleanup. A picture began to emerge, one far darker than even the harshest critics had imagined. The drug problem was worse than anyone publicly acknowledged. Investigators found spice residue in over 60% of cells on N Wing. They found elaborate smuggling networks, price lists, and debt records. One cell had over £3,000 worth of spice hidden in it, a fortune in prison currency. The staffing crisis was equally severe. Records showed that in the month before the riot, N Wing had operated at 40% of its required staffing level on multiple shifts. There were nights when a single officer was responsible for over 200 inmates. Impossible. Dangerous. Criminal negligence, some said. Maintenance records revealed that over 600 repair requests had been ignored or delayed for months before the riot. Broken windows, faulty locks, damaged security systems, all unfixed due to budget constraints imposed by G4S to maximize profits. Training records showed that many newer officers had received only minimal preparation. Some had been on the job for less than 6 weeks when the riot erupted. They'd been thrown into one of Britain's toughest prisons with barely any idea what they were doing. And perhaps most damning, investigators found evidence of a toxic culture. Officers who'd raised safety concerns had been ignored or even disciplined for being negative. Incident reports had been downplayed or altered to make statistics look better. G4S management had been more concerned with meeting performance targets on paper than ensuring actual safety. The inmates had been telling the truth about many of their grievances. HMP Birmingham had become a warehouse, not a prison. Rehabilitation programs had been slashed. Inmates spent 23 hours a day locked in cells with nothing to do. The few programs that existed had waiting lists of months or years. As the investigation progressed through late December, the human stories began to emerge. The media found family members of inmates willing to talk. They found officers willing to break their silence despite fears of retaliation from G4S. Investigative journalists dug into G4SS finances. They discovered that despite managing Birmingham poorly, the company had made millions in profit from the contract. Executives had received substantial bonuses. Shareholders had been paid dividends. All while the prison crumbled. Public outrage grew. Questions were raised in Parliament. The opposition Labour Party demanded the government take back control of Birmingham and end prison privatisation. The Conservative government defended privatisation in principle but admitted Birmingham was an unacceptable failure. Peter Dawson, the regional director who'd given that awful press conference, quietly resigned. Several other G4S executives involved in Birmingham's management followed. The company's stock price dropped. They faced potential legal action from both the government and victims of the riot. But stripping G4S of the contract was just the beginning. The real question was what would happen next. The inmate trials, Justice and Injustice, January, June 2017. In early 2017, as HMP Birmingham underwent repairs and returned to public management, the legal consequences for the riot participants began to unfold. Over 120 inmates faced additional charges ranging from prison mutiny to arson to assault. The trials were held at Birmingham Crown Court, an imposing building not far from the prison itself. The courtroom was packed for each case. Media, families, prison reform advocates, and curious members of the public all wanted to witness justice being served. But justice is complicated, especially when the system itself was partially to blame. The first trials began in February 2017. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Regardless of conditions at the prison, rioting and violence were crimes. The defendants had destroyed property, endangered lives, and caused millions in damage. They needed to be punished to send a message that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated. The defense argued something more nuanced, that the inmates had been driven to desperation by inhumane conditions. That G4SS negligence had created a powder keg. That while the riot was wrong, it was also understandable, perhaps even inevitable. Terence T. Block Williams was among the first to be tried. Prosecutors painted him as a violent gang leader who'd orchestrated chaos for his own power. They presented evidence that he'd assaulted other inmates, destroyed property, and led the resistance against the Tornado teams. His defense attorney presented a different picture. Yes, T. Block had participated in the riot, but he'd also prevented several instances of more serious violence. He'd stopped inmates from attacking the sex offender wing. He'd helped negotiate the safe passage of medical staff. And he'd ultimately surrendered peacefully when he could have fought to the bloody end. The defense also called witnesses to describe conditions at Birmingham. Former inmates testified about the spice epidemic, the violence, the neglect. Even some officers testified, admitting the prison had been dangerously mismanaged. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They found T. Block guilty of prison mutiny and destruction of property, but acquitted him of the most serious assault charges. The judge sentenced him to an additional 5 years on top of his existing sentence. As T. Block was led away, he shouted to the courtroom, 5 years for telling the truth. 5 years for saying this system is broken. Remember Birmingham. Don't let them forget what happened there. The trials continued through the spring. Some inmates received similar sentences, 3 to 6 additional years. Others, especially those who'd surrendered quickly and hadn't engaged in violence, received lighter sentences or even time served. The most controversial trial involved Marcus Williams, the inmate who'd written that letter about his daughter during the riot. He was charged with property destruction and participation in the riot, but prosecutors acknowledged he hadn't assaulted anyone and had actually tried to calm other inmates. His defense team brought his 12-year-old daughter to testify. She spoke about how her father had changed in prison, how he'd been working on rehabilitation programs before G4S cut most of them, how he told her he wanted to be better when he got out. "My dad made a mistake that put him in prison," she said, voice shaking but determined. "But he's been trying so hard to be better. Then they took away his programs. Then the riot happened and he got scared and angry like everyone else. He's not a bad person. He's my dad and I love him and I just want him to come home someday." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, including the judge. Marcus Williams was sentenced to an additional 18 months, far less than prosecutors had requested. The judge stated, "While your participation in the riot cannot be excused, the court recognizes that HMP Birmingham failed you as much as you failed society's expectations. I hope you use this time to continue your rehabilitation." Not all the stories were sympathetic. Several inmates who'd assaulted officers or other inmates received much harsher sentences. One man who'd thrown a television at officers, nearly killing one, received an additional 8 years. Another who'd participated in attacking sex offenders received 7 additional years. By June 2017, most of the trials were concluded. Over 90 inmates had received additional sentences totaling nearly 400 years combined. The average additional sentence was about 4 years. But throughout the trials, a common theme emerged in testimony. The system had failed everyone. The inmates, the officers, the public. HMP Birmingham had been a disaster waiting to happen, and on December 16, 2016, it finally did. The question now was whether anything would actually change. The reform attempts, promises and reality, 2017 to 2018. When HMP Birmingham returned to public management in January 2017, the government promised sweeping reforms. This would be a new beginning, a model for how to properly run a prison. Lessons had been learned. Things would change. The new governor, or experienced prison administrator named Sarah Chen, arrived with ambitious plans. She'd managed several troubled prisons before and had a reputation for being tough but fair, someone who could restore order while also treating inmates humanely. Her first priority was staff. The prison desperately needed experienced officers. The government provided funding to hire 150 additional officers, bringing staffing levels back to where they should have been all along. They also implemented better training programs, ensuring new officers were properly prepared. Many former officers who'd quit under G4S were invited to return. Some did, attracted by better pay and the promise of proper support. Others refused, too traumatized or disillusioned to come back. Governor Chen also tackled the drug problem aggressively. New security scanners were installed. Sniffer dogs were deployed regularly. Phone blocking technology was tested to prevent use of smuggled mobiles. Visiting procedures were tightened, though Chen was careful not to punish families for the actions of smugglers. Most importantly, she ordered a complete renovation of the damaged wings. This wasn't just repair work, it was modernization. New windows with better security features, improved ventilation systems, better lighting. The Victorian bones of the prison remained, but the worst aspects were updated. The education centre and chapel were completely rebuilt. Rehabilitation programs were expanded. Chen brought in drug treatment specialists, mental health professionals, and vocational training instructors. She wanted inmates to have hope, purpose, and a path forward. By mid-2017, HMP Birmingham was looking and functioning better than it had in years. Violence was down. Drug seizures were up, suggesting better security rather than increased drug use. Officer morale was improving. The prison was starting to feel stable. Media outlets that had savaged Birmingham after the riot now ran cautiously optimistic stories about the turnaround. From chaos to order, Birmingham Prison's remarkable recovery read one headline. Politicians pointed to Birmingham as proof that proper investment in prisons could work. But beneath the surface, problems remained. The first issue was money. The government had provided emergency funding after the riot, but that was temporary. By 2018, budget pressures were returning. The Ministry of Justice was under pressure to cut costs across the entire prison system. Birmingham's extra funding was gradually reduced. Governor Chen fought hard to maintain staffing levels and programs, but she was fighting against broader political realities. Britain's austerity policies meant every government department was being squeezed. Prisons weren't a political priority. The public had largely moved on from the Birmingham riot. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the gains began to erode. Positions that became vacant weren't always filled immediately. Program funding was trimmed. Maintenance requests started taking longer to fulfill. It wasn't a collapse, just a slow slide back toward the problems that had caused the crisis in the first place. The second issue was the inmates themselves. The riot had created a legend. Inmates across Britain's prison system had heard about the day Birmingham fell. Some saw it as inspiration, proof that inmates could fight back against poor conditions. Others saw it as a cautionary tale of wasted opportunity and harsh consequences. But everyone knew about it. And that knowledge changed the dynamics of every prison. Tensions that might have been manageable before now carried the implicit threat. Remember Birmingham. We could do that here too. Between 2017 and 2019, several other British prisons experienced serious disturbances, though none reached the scale of Birmingham. But the spectre of December 16, 2016 hung over every incident. Prison authorities were terrified of another major riot. That fear sometimes led to overreaction, which increased tensions, which increased the risk of the very thing they feared. The third issue was the broader system. Birmingham hadn't existed in isolation. The problems that plagued it, overcrowding, drugs, violence, poor conditions, existed across many British prisons. Fixing one prison didn't fix the system. And unless the system changed, the same conditions that led to the Birmingham riot would eventually lead to another crisis somewhere else. Prison reform advocates tried to use Birmingham as a catalyst for broader change. They published reports, lobbied politicians, organized campaigns. They argued for reduced prison populations, better rehabilitation, ending short sentences that just cycled people through the system without helping them. Some modest reforms were implemented. The government pledged to build more prison spaces to reduce overcrowding. They increased overall prison budgets slightly. They launched reviews of drug prevention strategies. But the fundamental model didn't change. Britain still had one of the highest incarceration rates in Western Europe. Prisons were still used primarily for punishment rather than rehabilitation. The political will for transformative change simply wasn't there. By 2019, 3 years after the riot, HMP Birmingham was functioning adequately. Better than under G4S, certainly. Better than the months leading up to the riot. But not as good as the optimistic visions of 2017 had promised. It was stable. But stability isn't the same as success. The personal aftermath, lives changed forever, 2017 to 2020. The riot's impact extended far beyond the prison walls. Hundreds of lives were permanently altered by those 12 hours of chaos. Let's follow some of the individuals whose stories we've touched on. Terence T. Block Williams, the inmate who led the resistance on N Wing, was transferred to HMP Wakefield, one of Britain's highest security prisons, housing the most dangerous criminals. The additional 5 years on his sentence meant he wouldn't be eligible for parole until 2031, when he'd be 44 years old. But something changed in T Block after the riot. Prison authorities noted that his behavior improved significantly. He was no longer the gang leader causing problems. He participated in every rehabilitation program offered. He took distance learning courses and earned qualifications in construction and business management. In a 2019 interview with a journalist allowed to visit Wakefield, T Block reflected on the riot. I thought I was making a statement. I thought I was being powerful. Looking back, I was just scared and angry. Yeah, conditions at Birmingham were terrible. Yeah, something needed to change. But what I did, what we all did, it didn't fix anything. It just gave politicians an excuse to ignore us more because we are violent criminals who destroy things. If I could go back, I'd find a better way to fight. When asked what he'd do after release, T Block was thoughtful. I've got a lot of time to plan that. 14 more years if I'm lucky, could be 20 if I mess up. But I think about my legacy. Do I want to be remembered as the guy who led a prison riot? Or do I want to build something? Help kids in my community stay out of gangs? Maybe I can turn this into something positive. Maybe. Marcus Williams, the inmate who wrote the emotional letter about his daughter, was released in 2019 after serving the additional 18 months from the riot. He'd been scheduled for release in 2018 originally, so the riot cost him an extra year away from his daughter. His release day was documented by a journalist from The Guardian. His daughter, now 15, was there to meet him. The reunion was captured in a photograph that became iconic. Father and daughter embracing outside the prison gates, both crying, both smiling, both knowing the road ahead would be difficult, but at least they'd walk it together. Marcus struggled to find employment with a conviction for armed robbery and participation in a prison riot. He worked odd jobs, stayed with family members, attended required probation meetings. But he also volunteered with a prison reform charity, speaking to young people about the realities of incarceration. In a 2020 speech to a youth group in Birmingham, Marcus said, "Prison was supposed to punish me for my crime. And it did. I lost 8 years of my life. I missed my daughter growing up. I lived in fear and degradation. But prison was also supposed to rehabilitate me, help me become better. For most of my sentence, especially at Birmingham under G4S, that happened. I got worse, not better. It wasn't until after the riot, when they brought back proper programs and support, that I actually started healing and growing. We need to ask ourselves, what do we want prisons to do? Because right now, they're just breaking people." For the officers who lived through the riot, the aftermath was equally challenging. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. The 12 hours of feeling helpless, trapped, possibly about to die, it left deep psychological scars. Michael Torres, one of the officers who'd been trapped in the N-Wing office during the riot, never returned to prison work. He tried. He completed the trauma counseling. He visited Birmingham after it reopened. But the moment he walked through those gates, he had a panic attack. "I couldn't breathe," he told a support group for prison officers. "All I could see was that day. The fires, the shouting, the feeling of being completely powerless. I'd given 15 years to the prison service. I loved my job, or at least I used to. But Birmingham broke something in me. I can't go back." Michael retrained as a counselor, working with at-risk youth. He channeled his experience into prevention, trying to keep kids from ending up in the system that had traumatized him. He also became an advocate for better support for prison staff, testifying before Parliament about the mental health crisis among prison officers. Sarah Chen, the governor who led Birmingham's recovery, stayed for 3 years before moving to a position in the Ministry of Justice. She'd accomplished much at Birmingham, but the constant battle for resources, the slow erosion of her reforms, and the emotional toll of managing a trauma-scarred institution eventually wore her down. In her farewell speech to Birmingham staff in 2020, she was candidly reflective. "We've come a long way since 2016. This prison is safer, more humane, and more functional than it was then. But I'll be honest, we haven't gone far enough. The system is still broken. We still don't have enough staff, enough programs, enough hope to offer the people in our care. I'm proud of what we've accomplished, but I'm frustrated by what we couldn't do. The fight continues, and I hope whoever comes after me continues fighting." Her successor was a more traditional governor, focused on security and order rather than reform and rehabilitation. Some of Chen's innovations were maintained. Others were quietly discontinued as inefficient or too expensive. Birmingham didn't collapse again, but the progressive vision faded. And what about the families? The thousands of people connected to inmates and officers whose lives were disrupted by the riot? They were the forgotten victims. Media attention focused on the dramatic elements, the riot, the trials, the policy debates. But for every inmate who faced extra time, there was a family facing extra years of separation, stress, and struggle. For every officer traumatized, there was a spouse dealing with a partner's PTSD, children confused by a parent's mood swings. A 2018 study by a prison charity found that families of Birmingham riot participants reported significantly higher rates of financial hardship, mental health issues, and relationship breakdown compared to similar families whose loved ones weren't involved. The riot had ripple effects that spread through communities, touching people who'd never set foot in HMP Birmingham, but whose lives were nonetheless changed by what happened there on December 16, 2016. 6 years. 6 years have passed since that cold December day when HMP Birmingham descended into chaos. 6 years to reflect, to reform, to ensure it never happens again. So what's changed? In 2020, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons released a comprehensive follow-up report on HMP Birmingham. The findings were mixed at best. The prison was stable, yes. It was functional. But many of the underlying issues that had caused the riot persisted in varying degrees. Overcrowding remained a problem. Not as severe as 2016, but inmates were still doubled up in cells designed for one person. Drug use had decreased but hadn't been eliminated. Spice was still getting in, along with newer synthetic drugs that were even harder to detect. Violence had reduced significantly from the pre-riot days, but it was still higher than the national average. Gang activity continued. The cultural scars of the riot remained, a certain level of tension between staff and inmates that never fully healed. But Birmingham's story is just one chapter in a much larger book. Between 2016 and 2026, British prisons experienced numerous serious incidents. In 2018, HMP Liverpool had a disturbance involving 150 inmates that lasted 8 hours. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, several prisons came dangerously close to riot situations as lockdowns and isolation drove already tense populations to breaking points. In 2022, HMP Manchester had a major drug-related incident where 37 inmates required hospitalisation in a single day due to contaminated spice. In 2024, HMP Leeds experienced a coordinated protest where over 200 inmates refused to return to cells for 3 days, demanding better conditions. None reached the scale of Birmingham, but all echoed the same themes: overcrowding, drugs, violence, neglect, desperation. The political response to these incidents followed a predictable pattern. Initial outrage, promises of reform, some modest changes. Then the news cycle moves on, public attention shifts, and the fundamental problems remain. Privatisation of prisons continued despite the Birmingham disaster, though companies became more cautious. G4S eventually sold their prison contracts to other firms, rebranding and restructuring but never truly accepting responsibility for what happened at Birmingham. Prison populations continued to grow. Britain's incarceration rate remained one of the highest in Western Europe. Sentencing policies continued to favour punishment over rehabilitation. Short sentences that accomplished little except interrupting lives remained common. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 to 2021 temporarily reduced prison populations as courts slowed, and some inmates were released early to prevent viral spread. But by 2023, numbers were climbing again. The system was straining again. The same warnings that preceded Birmingham were being sounded about other facilities. In December 2023, on the 7th anniversary of the Birmingham Riot, a coalition of prison reform organisations held a memorial event. They invited former inmates, officers, families, and advocates to reflect on what had happened and what had changed. The event was held not at a conference centre or government building, but outside the walls of HMP Birmingham itself. About 200 people gathered in the cold, looking up at those Victorian walls that had witnessed so much suffering, violence, and finally, 12 hours of complete chaos. Marcus Williams was there, now working full-time for a prisoner advocacy group. He spoke to the crowd. 7 years ago, I was inside those walls when they fell. I participated in something I'm not proud of, but I understand why it happened. We were treated like animals, so we acted like animals. The question I have for everyone here, for society, is this: what have we learned? Are we treating people in there any better now? Are we giving them hope, purpose, rehabilitation? Or are we just warehousing them and waiting for the next explosion? A former Birmingham officer spoke next, someone who'd returned to work after the riot and stayed for 5 years before finally leaving. I loved being a prison officer. I believed in the job. I believed we could make a difference. But the system is designed to fail. We are given impossible tasks with inadequate resources. We are told to rehabilitate people while locking them in cells 23 hours a day. We are told to keep them safe while drugs flood in unchecked. We are told to be professional while being assaulted and spat on with minimal consequences for the perpetrators. Something has to change. Not just at Birmingham. Everywhere. The mother of an inmate spoke, her son still incarcerated at a different facility. My son made mistakes. He hurt people. He deserves punishment. I'm not saying he doesn't, but he also deserves a chance to become better. Prison should be making him better, preparing him to come home and contribute to society. Instead, it's making him harder, angrier, more damaged. When he finally gets out, he'll be more dangerous than when he went in. How does that help anyone? How does that make society safer? A criminal justice professor from Birmingham University presented research. The Birmingham riot cost approximately £10 million when you factor in damage, trials, and increased security measures. That's just the direct costs. Indirect costs, trauma, lost productivity, damaged lives, probably triple that figure. For £30 million, we could have funded comprehensive rehabilitation programs at Birmingham and 10 other prisons for 5 years. We could have hired hundreds of additional officers. We could have built new, modern facilities. Instead, we are spending that money cleaning up a disaster that was entirely preventable. This is the economics of neglect. It's cheaper to do it right the first time, but we never do. The event ended with a moment of silence. Not for the dead, remarkably, no one died in the Birmingham riot, but for the lost potential, for the wasted lives, for the opportunities for redemption that were squandered, for the society that pays the price for a broken system. As the crowd dispersed, some people placed flowers and notes at the prison gates. One note, written in a child's handwriting, read, "My daddy is in prison. Please help him come home better, not worse." That note stayed there for weeks before the weather finally destroyed it. But the message remained. Today, in 2026, HMP Birmingham continues to operate. It houses about 1,200 inmates in a facility built for 600. It has a new governor, the third since Sarah Chen left. It has experienced staff and new officers. It has programs and problems, successes and failures. It's a prison, doing what prisons do. The cell where the riot started on December 16, 2016, still exists. It's been repaired, repainted, and now houses a different inmate serving time for a different crime. That inmate probably doesn't know the history of the cell he sleeps in, doesn't know that his bed sits where the phone was found that triggered 12 hours of chaos. The wing offices where officers huddled in fear have been renovated. The CCTV cameras that were destroyed have been replaced with newer models. The education centre that burned has been rebuilt. The scars have been covered, but they remain beneath the surface. N-Wing still has a reputation. Inmates and officers who work there know its history. There's a certain wariness, a certain edge that never quite goes away. It's the wing that fell first. The wing that fought hardest. The wing that changed everything and nothing. Some of the inmates who participated in the riot are still incarcerated, serving out their extended sentences. Some have been released and are trying to rebuild lives in a society that doesn't forget criminal records. Some have reoffended and are back in prison, caught in the cycle the system claims to break but often reinforces. Some of the officers who survived the riot are still working in prisons, though usually not at Birmingham. Some found other careers. Some are still dealing with trauma, still having nightmares, still unable to enter enclosed spaces without panic. The families continue their lives, visiting rooms on weekends, taking phone calls, counting down the years until reunion. Or maybe not. Some families broke apart under the strain, relationships that couldn't survive the added years, the added stress, the added shame of being connected to a notorious riot. And the system. The British prison system in 2026 looks remarkably similar to how it looked in 2016. Larger, more expensive, but fundamentally unchanged. The same problems on a slightly different scale. There are good people fighting for reform. Officers who care, governors who try, charities that advocate, researchers who document, politicians who occasionally listen. Change happens in small increments, a program here, a policy there, a gradual shift in public consciousness. But there hasn't been the transformative change that many hoped the Birmingham riot would catalyse. It was a warning that was partially heeded and mostly ignored. The question that haunts everyone who knows the story is simple and terrible. Will it happen again? The conditions that created Birmingham haven't been eliminated. They've been managed, mitigated, temporarily suppressed. But they exist. In Birmingham and in dozens of other prisons across Britain. The pressure builds. The cracks appear. The warnings are issued. And then one day, somewhere, something will snap. Maybe it will be a confiscated phone. Maybe it will be a fight that escalates. Maybe it will be one inmate, pushed too far, who decides he has nothing left to lose. And 12 hours of chaos will erupt again. Different prison. Different people. Same story. Outro. The unanswered question. December 16th, 2016. A date that most of Britain has forgotten. A date that everyone connected to HMP Birmingham will remember forever. 4 wings. 12 hours. 600 inmates. 150 officers. Millions in damage. Hundreds of lives changed. And in the end, what did it accomplish? The honest answer is complicated and unsatisfying. It accomplished attention, for a moment. It accomplished some reforms, temporary and incomplete. It accomplished consequences, mostly for the powerless participants, rarely for the powerful architects of the system that failed. But it didn't accomplish transformation. It didn't break the cycle. It didn't fundamentally change how Britain thinks about crime, punishment, and rehabilitation. The inmates who rioted wanted to be heard. They wanted someone to acknowledge their humanity, their suffering, their desperation. They were heard, for a new cycle. Then the nation moved on to other stories, other crises, other outrages. The officers who survived wanted change. They wanted adequate staffing, proper training, safe working conditions. They got some improvements, until budget cuts returned and the gains eroded. The families wanted their loved ones to come home better, not worse. Some did. Many didn't. The system remains better at breaking people than healing them. And society. Society wanted safety, order, justice. What society got was a brief moment of chaos that revealed the fragility of the system meant to protect it. The walls are strong, but they contain powder kegs. HMP Birmingham, once Winson Green, the prison where men were hanged, where darkness soaked into Victorian stones, stands today as a monument to a simple truth. You cannot warehouse human beings indefinitely in degrading conditions and expect anything but eventual explosion. The riot was predictable. It was preventable. It was a failure of policy, of management, of societal priorities. And unless those fundamental failures are addressed, it's also replicable. Somewhere in Britain tonight, there's a prison officer understaffed and overwhelmed, wondering how to keep order with half the people needed. There's an inmate locked in a cell for the 23rd hour of the day, watching life pass through a narrow window, feeling hope drain away. There's a governor fighting for resources that never come, filing reports that no one reads, sounding alarms that no one heeds. And somewhere, the next Birmingham is waiting to happen. The question isn't if. The question is when. And whether, this time, anyone will listen. This has been the story of HMP Birmingham. A story of failure and chaos, of violence and consequence, of a system pushed to breaking point and beyond. A story that should have changed everything and changed too little. A story that isn't over. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you angry or sad or determined that things need to change, don't just watch and forget. Share this video. Start conversations. Contact your representatives. Support organizations working for prison reform. Because the people inside those walls are still people. Broken, sometimes dangerous, always human. And the system that's supposed to rehabilitate them is still broken too. The inmates at Birmingham tried to make the world listen through violence and destruction. That was wrong. But their underlying message wasn't. The system is failing everyone. Inmates, officers, families, society itself. You've heard their story now. The question is, what will you do with it? Thanks for watching. If you want to stay informed about criminal justice issues, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Drop a comment and let us know your thoughts about the Birmingham riot and prison reform. And check out our other documentaries on true crime and justice system failures. Remember, the walls are strong, but what happens inside them affects all of us outside them. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop demanding better.